Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We are so excited that you were willing to join us virtually. We wish we could have been in person, but we will get back to in-person programming as soon as it is safe to do so. My name is Ashley Clayborn. I am the director at UA Little Rock Downtown, and we are so excited to co-host this event in collaboration with the UA Little Rock Racial Barriers Committee, Student Government Association, the Center for Arkansas History and Culture, and the Central Arkansas Library System. We also want to express our gratitude to Chancellor Drayle for her support and to all of our community partners who worked with us on statewide planning for the National Day of Racial Healing. The Planning Commission was organized by the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, and we are so grateful for all of their dedication and support in getting this programming moving forward. You can find more information about events happening across the state of Arkansas at apjmm.org or the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement's website. The National Day of Racial Healing is an annual reminder for us to foster engaged conversations on racial healing, racial equity, and justice. It is a reminder and a time for truth-telling and community action. With that in mind, we have planned this conversation around the importance of truth-telling in commemoration efforts. With us tonight is Dr. Guy Lancaster, who serves as the editor for the online Encyclopedia of Arkansas. It is a project of the Central Arkansas Library System, and he is the author, co-author, or editor of 5 books on racial violence. Most recently, American Atrocity, The Types of Lynching or Violence and Lynching. Dr. Lancaster will provide some background for this conversation with Sorry, I got muted at some point. Dr. Lancaster will provide some background for this conversation with Dr. Dave Tell, author of Remembering Emmett Till, and pose a few questions about his work on commemoration efforts in Mississippi. We will conclude with time for questions from attendees. We do ask that you pose any questions in the chat feature here on Zoom, and a co-host will ask those questions to the speakers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are going to talk about some difficult and important topics. We would like to make sure that you're aware that we have counselors from UA Little Rock Counseling Center who are online with us tonight, and you can reach them by visiting them in person at the Student Services Center in room 118, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, by phone at 501-916-3185, or email at counselingservices@ualr.edu. With all that being said, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Lancaster and Dr. Tell to speak with us tonight.
Thank you, Ashley, for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who helped put this on. Thank you, Dr. Tell, for agreeing to be a part of this. I'm very excited about this. I'm just going to say a few brief comments kind of to tie this into some of Arkansas's history, because recently I was asked while giving a presentation elsewhere whether I knew of any Arkansas analogs to the lynching of Emmett Till. That is, was I aware of any Black teenagers who were lynched in our state? And the answer is yes, that there have been a number of Black teenagers who had been lynched here in Arkansas. But the youngest victim that I knew of was someone who perhaps had not even reached his teenage years, a youth named Jim Sanders, who was killed in rural Pulaski County in 1882 here in Central Arkansas. Now, there's very little information about him in the reports of his killing. At the time, in 1880, at the time of the census, there were 2 African Americans named James Sanders in Pulaski County. And the most likely match is a James Sanders born in around 1872, who was living in Badgett Township with his parents, Charlie and Julia Sanders. So based on census information alone, he would have been 10 years old in 1882. but his birth year is listed as estimated, so it may have been incorrect. While later lynching reports often dominated headlines on the front page, the first mention of Jim Sanders shows up at the very bottom of a local paragraphs column on the 4th page of the May 30, 1882 Arkansas Gazette. In fact, the whole report is so brief that it can be quoted here in full. It goes, "While sweeping out Parker's schoolhouse in Union Township last Saturday evening, Miss Nancy Carr was indecently attacked by a colored youth named Jim Sanders. She screamed, and her cries were heard by William Pinson, who rushed into the building and, picking up Sanders' double-barrel shotgun, fired at the latter while he was escaping. Sanders was arrested Sunday and sent back for identification. That night, the guard in charge of him was overpowered, and enough buckshot to kill a score of men were lodged in his body. The coroner went down to hold an inquest yesterday, but did not return late last night. Comments on the case are properly reserved until the evidence is known." Now, this brief account leaves a whole lot unsaid, especially with its passive construction, which rather avoids identifying in any way the identity of the person or persons who put so much buckshot into Sanders' body. However, national reports did fill in the blanks somewhat. The Ottawa Free Trader, published in Illinois, reported that Sanders was not held in a jail, but rather, quote, placed in a framed building preparatory to the preliminary examination. While the Rock Island Argus, also of Illinois, holds that Sanders was interned in a jail. According to the Ottawa newspaper, Sanders was killed by a mob composed entirely of masked men. It reported, quote, "The matter has created intense feeling in the neighborhood, and when the inquest was held next day, threats were made of further trouble. A great many colored people live in the vicinity, nearly all of whom are very bitter regarding the shooting of Sanders." Apparently, knowledge of this understandable bitterness created some trepidation on the part of local whites, for the Gazette reported a week later that, quote, "White people at and near Wrightsville and Sweet Home heard that the colored people were arming to slaughter them and actually took their children and wives to the woods and secreted them." However, Black residents also heard rumors that a number of their own had been, quote, "seized and murdered while at worship in a church." The county sheriff, in response to these rumors, sent Frank Botsford, the police chief of Little Rock, down to investigate. Botsford's conclusion was that no one had any intention for disorder. Quote, "Some fool or knave said just enough to create a scare, that is all." The Gazette reported on June 9 that the prisoners from Union Township charged with complicity in the killing of young Sanders, prisoners who go unnamed, had been discharged the previous day on account of, quote, "no discriminatory evidence being found against them." Apparently, rumors about the complicity of Sheriff W.S. Oliver had been circulating, for the Little Rock Republican printed a column recounting an official investigation into reports that the sheriff had handed Sanders over to the mob. According to this report, Oliver never had actual custody of Sanders, which might substantiate accounts that Sanders was never placed formally in jail. But again, we don't know the value of this report. As far as the reason for the lynching goes, what do we make of the assertion that Miss Nancy Carr was indecently attacked by a colored youth named Jim Sanders? We have no information provided by her or any witness as to what actually happened. At this point, Nancy Carr would have been 21 years old, more than twice the age of her ostensible attacker, a 10-year-old boy. There's reference in the story to a double-barrel shotgun apparently owned by Sanders, although a child possessing such a gun at this time and place would perhaps not have been that strange, nor does the presence of this gun explain what is meant by, quote, "indecently attacked." The gun doesn't play any role at all in subsequent reports. It is within the realm of possibility that Sanders attacked Carr in some manner, but it may also be possible that he surprised her somehow, leading to her crying out and attracting the attention of someone who interpreted matters in a very predictable way. Just as we still do not know exactly what happened between Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant in the store in Money, Mississippi, So we'll probably never know what happened between Jim Sanders and Nancy Carr here in central Arkansas. But while the attempt to ascertain facts is the crux of the historian's work, there is one documented fact that proves more important than all the others. Jim Sanders was 10 years old or thereabouts at the time that these masked men showed up and shot into his body enough buckshot to kill a score of men. All the excuses lynch mobs gave for their activities, law and order, defending Southern white womanhood, etc., they have to be weighed against this murder of a child. So with that said, I would like to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. David Till. Dave Till is a professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas. He's the author of Confessional Crises and Cultural Politics in 20th Century America, published by Penn State University Press in 2012. And also this book, Remembering Emmett Till, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. This book was listed as a 2019 Book of the Year by The Economist and was winner of the 2020 McLemore Prize and the 2021 Brian Caldwell Smith Book Award. And for my own part, I can tell a book is great if I've been reading along and found that, I've underlined most of a page because, I want to be able to refer back to that. And this is definitely a very underlined book. Professor Till is a former fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities and a founding director of the Emmett Till Memory Project, which is a GPS-enabled smartphone app dedicated to commemorating the murder of Emmett Till. His writing on the Till murder has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Atlantic Money, and LitHub. From writing a bulletproof sign to designing an exhibit for the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Dr. Till is firmly committed to the public value of the humanities. He is a past president of the American Society for the History of Rhetoric and the inaugural Public Humanities Officer for the Rhetoric Society of America. Professor Till is co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities and the Alan J. Sigler Faculty Fellow in the University Honors Program. He holds courtesy appointments in American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And with that, I will turn this over to Dave Till.
Thank you, Guy, for the introduction, and thank you in advance for the conversation tonight. Thank you, Ashley, for the arrangements and all your work leading up to this. It's an honor to be with you virtually. I'm coming to you from my basement in Lawrence, Kansas. I wish I could be with you in person. I'd love to see the space of the University of Arkansas Little Rock. I love the idea that a university has a front porch, which is the mission of University of Arkansas downtown. As Guy said, I'm pretty committed to the idea that good humanities are public humanities. And so to see the mission of UA Little Rock downtown, it heartens me. Thanks also to the Racial Barriers Committee, the Student Government Association, the Center for Arkansas History and Culture, and the Central Arkansas Library System. Totally appreciate the way you have all come together to make tonight possible. Let me start with about a 1-minute version of the story of the 1955 murder of Emmett Till. I'm only going to spend 1 minute on it, partially because I think you probably know most of the story, but also because, as Ashley suggested, the focus of tonight is on commemoration and its role or its potential for reconciliation. So I want to spend most of the time there. But before we get there, the story does start in the summer of 1955. In that summer, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy living in Chicago. In August of that year, while visiting his cousins in the Mississippi Delta, he whistled at Carolyn Bryant, the 21-year-old shopkeeper of Bryant's Grocery in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. 3 days later, he was lynched. He was kidnapped, tortured, shot, and dropped in a river. 3 days after that, his body was found. A month after that, 2 of the murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury. And 3 months after the trial, Martin Luther King Jr. heard Till's story told from the pulpit of his own Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and he never forgot it. So I want to start here, perhaps because it's January 19 or 18. I want to start with King, and I want to fast forward 8 years from the summer of 1955, and I want to take you to June 23rd, 1963. King is in Detroit, and he's still talking about Emmett Till. I'm just going to read you one sentence of King's speech from that Detroit afternoon, and I hope you'll recognize the language. Here's King. I have a dream this afternoon that there will be a day when we no longer face the atrocities that Emmett Till had to face. I have a dream. I hope you recognize the language, but I hope there's a little sort of red flag going up too that, wait, this speech was in DC, and you're right. 2 months later, King gave the I Have a Dream speech a second time. It worked so well in Detroit, he thought he'd try it again, this time from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And when he gave the speech a second time, two things happened. First, the speech became famous, right? Perhaps the single most famous speech in all of American history. But a second thing happened too, that the moment, or rather in the moment that the speech became famous, the reference to Emmett Till was cut. In the same moment that the speech became the primary document of the civil rights movement, Emmett Till lost his place in that document. Now, I don't think that King cut Till intentionally. The speech, I don't know, I imagine it as something like a jazz performance, a little bit different every time, but intentional or not. The erasure of Till from the official text of the civil rights movement proved all too prophetic, because get this, and this is truly amazing to me. For the remainder of the 20th century, Till's story was never well told. You have to count, if you're counting, if you're starting from the Till murder, you have to count 49 years and 11 months before the state of Mississippi dropped a single dollar on commemorating the Emmett Till tragedy. In 2005, that is 49 years and 11 months after the murder, a local group of citizens in Tallahatchie County decided that this 50-year silence was intolerable. And so they organized, they fundraised, and they used a $15,000 donation from Morgan Freeman to do something that had never been done before. That is, they told Till's story on the landscape of the Delta by putting up a series of commemorative signs that for the first time would acknowledge, officially acknowledge in public places, the tragedy that happened in their own community. And I think you know, or you might know, what happened next. No sooner had those signs been put up that they became objects of persistent and targeted vandalism. In a second, I'm going to share some slides with you and walk you through some of the history of this vandalism. I do so primarily because it rather dramatically sets the stage for the story of Emmett Till commemoration, and it also is a handy way for me to share how it is that me, of all people, a white guy from Kansas, got involved in Emmett Till commemoration. So let me find some slides here, and I'll walk you through the story of the vandalism, some of the responses to the vandalism, and how I got involved. Can you all see the slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. Thank you. Love the audio response. Okay, what you're seeing right here, this is the very first sign. This was dedicated July 1st, 2005. The very first sign dedicated to the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi. You can see what happened within weeks. It was spray painted. This is the sign that, well, it doesn't actually currently stand, but that's another story. This sign stood in front of Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. That's the site where Emmett Till whistled. If you could read these words on this sign would tell you that this site is ground zero of the American civil rights movement. Among civil rights historians, that's a contested claim. Among people in Mississippi, that's the gospel truth. But it's dramatic to me that this is the sign, vandalized, marking the site of ground zero of the movement. This is the earliest possible picture I have, and that's a way of saying I don't have a pre-vandalized picture of this site. What you're looking at here is a sign that was stolen, and in the background you see the truck and the tire tracks going off to the right. If you could follow those tire tracks about another 15 yards, you would get to the Tallahatchie River. And the sign that was installed here in the spring of 2008 marked the place where Till's body was pulled from the water. It was installed in the spring of 2008. Within a few months, it was stolen. It was quickly replaced by the fall of 2008. And then over the course of the next 8 years, this sign accumulated 317 different bullet holes. That sign was replaced with a third sign at the same place, the place where Till's body was pulled from the water. This was a dedication in the summer of 2018. I'll let you guess how long you think this sign lasted before it too was vandalized. The answer is 32 days, and then this sign too was vandalized. And so what we have here, this picture is 2019. And so what we have here is from 2005 to 2019, 14 years of persistent and targeted vandalism. And that's how I got into this. In all honesty, 2022, right, the year we just turned, marks in some ways a 2-decade anniversary for me. It was 2002 when I first started writing about the commemoration of the murder of Emmett Till. But it wasn't until 2014 when the nonprofit that put up these signs, a group called the Emmett Till Memorial Commission of Tallahatchie County, called, and they said, Dave, we're holding a summit in July of 2014 in the Mississippi Delta on how to tell Till's story in the context of vandalism, and we hope you'll come down and help us out. It's a long story. I won't go into all the details, although I'm happy to take questions later if you're curious. But I went down there in the summer of 2014, and it quickly transformed my life. You know, it's a powerful thing. By that point, I had been writing and publishing about the murder for 10 years, but I had never been there. And I was a little bit unexpected for the power of what I'd find, to the power of talking with Simeon Wright, Till's cousin, who was sharing a bed with him the night he was abducted, and allowing Simeon, and in having Simeon tell me the story firsthand. Even though I knew the facts, you really can't account for the emotional power of hearing the story firsthand, or even just like the sheer factual knowledge of someone like Dale Killinger, who was the lead investigator for the FBI, and who probably knows more about the story than anybody else. So anyways, that 3-day meeting really has shaped the last, 8 years of my life. And so I want to spend a few minutes here telling you and just sort of showing you some of the responses to the vandalism, because in all honesty, they're amazing. Like, part of me, I don't know who vandalized it. I'm sure there's lots of people. But if I knew, I would love to tell them and reach out to them and say, I don't know why you shot this sign. I have a hunch there are racist reasons, and I have a hunch you meant it for evil, but look at the amazing work that has come out of the vandalism. So I just want to walk you through some of that work. In 2019, I helped dedicate the country's only bulletproof historical marker. That sign weighs 500 pounds and costs $12,000 And I want to tell you that no one on the commission thought that a bulletproof sign would solve the problem. In some ways, it honestly just feels like a bigger target. But the sign was donated by a big-hearted sign company in Brooklyn, New York, and no one on the commission was about to turn down the generous donation. And that day on October, it was October 17th, 2019, when we dedicated the sign, you kind of see the cars stretching out of the photo. It was amazing. Hundreds of people showed up for this moment. Shortly after we dedicated the bulletproof sign in October of 2019, I wrote this article for the New York Times, and I just want to draw your attention to the title. Put the vandalized Emmett Till signs in museums. Now there's a longer story here, because I wasn't always advocating for museums, but in conversations with the Till family, I came around to advocating for museums. And lo and behold, a few months after this article was published, I heard from two dedicated curators at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And then this past September, an exhibition called Reckoning with Remembrance opened on September 3rd of 2021. And I must say, I love this. This was in the grand mall side entrance of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. If you've been there, you know it's like the main entrance to the museum. And I love the thought here. The curators pointed out that in the background is this majestic, patriotic, sort of rah-rah exhibit called the Star-Spangled Banner. It's like a 200-foot artistic American flag. And they put this sign right underneath it as a way of saying, like, both of these things are part of American history, and to learn American history, you both have to have the Star-Spangled Banner exhibit and the Emmett Till exhibit. This has been taken out of circulation for the moment. The Smithsonian is currently creating a permanent exhibit that will not be in the entryway. They're creating a permanent room for it, and I'm not sure when it will come back online. This is me and my daughter, flanked by Wheeler Parker, the last living cousin and last living eyewitness of the abduction, on the left side of the photo, and Reverend Willie Williams on the right. He is one of the nonprofit leaders who has played a large role in putting up these signs. And then this is the next thing coming down the pipe. Mark your calendars for September 17th, 2022. The Indianapolis Children's Museum has created a $1.1 million traveling exhibit with an amazing sound and light show. The center of it is another bullet-riddled sign, as you can kind of see in this mock-up. And this exhibit is going to travel with the family from Indianapolis to the King Center in Atlanta, to the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, to the DuSable in Chicago, to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson. And it's going to spend about 5 weeks in each place. So I'm super excited to see this exhibit go. So isn't this amazing? Like, this all, like, there's lots of stuff going on in the world of Emmett Till, right? You've seen the ABC miniseries, or perhaps you know of it, but these things I'm sharing with you are direct outgrowths of the vandalism. And here's the last thing I want to share with you, and perhaps the most directly connected to me. This is the Emmett Till Memory Project. This guy mentioned the Emmett Till Memory Project is a smartphone app. It's a GPS-enabled app that will take you to 16 sites in the Mississippi Delta and 5 sites in Chicago. At each site, it will provide like historical narratives, historical photographs. It will provide links to archival documents and GPS directions to get you to the next site. So really everything you need to sort of explore the story of Emmett Till on your own. And if I can go back just real quickly to that meeting in 2014, the last sort of hurrah of that summit on how to tell the story in the context of vandalism, a friend of mine named Patrick Weems, who would go on to become the executive director of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, asked me if I would help him build an app. And like, the thinking was so simple. Like, if people are shooting our signs, it's a lot harder for them to shoot an app. And I said yes, thinking that it would be a side project, that I'd go back to my post at the University of Kansas and carry on business as usual. The project quickly took over my life. I won't go into all the details of how and why it happened, although feel free to probe. But I will say that the next summer 2015, I went back to the Mississippi Delta. I rented a car and I spent 2 weeks driving through Mississippi, finding these sites, spending time with the family, hearing what they had to say about the site, spending time with scholars. And as I was in Mississippi, I began hearing stories about Till's murder that I had never heard before. And that caught me off guard, because I had been not just writing, but publishing about the murder for a decade. And now I'm learning new things. And so those stories that I learned while making the Emmett Till Memory Project became the basis for my book that guy gave a kind of shout out to a second ago. I love telling that story for one very precise reason. And I hope you guys, I hope the crew at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock downtown can connect with this, because it's the story of the public humanities is often told in reverse. That is, it's often told that the public humanities is what happens when scholars take their scholarly research and then translate it for a public audience. Okay, what happened in this case is exactly the reverse of that. I was on a public humanities project trying to create a smartphone app to help tell the story of the murder in the context of vandalism. And what happened is that effort to do public work then supercharged my scholarship. And the next thing you know, I got a book. And then the book was published in 2019, and I'm still working on the Emmett Till Memory Project. In fact, just Friday, I met with, for the first time ever in the history of the Emmett Till Memory Project, we have professional designers and professional user experience people and professional software coders. So I'm no longer doing this work myself. And I can assure you that the next version, which will launch in about a year, is going to be way better. So that's a little bit about the context, both of Emmett Till commemoration, which started in Mississippi in 2005. And it's also a little bit about how I got into how it is that I got into this. So let me pause here and throw it back to Guy for a second. I think he has some more questions.
Hi, yes, this is great. You mentioned you've been here or been doing this research a long time, nearly 20 years now, I believe. You started in the early 2000s. What originally drew you to this particular subject?
Goodness gracious. That's a great question. So I was drawn to it. I mean, there's really two moments, right? There's moment number one, where I was a graduate student at Penn State University, trying to write a dissertation, full disclosure here, on the history of confession in America. And I was thinking things like, I don't know, like Bill Clinton confessing to Monica Lewinsky. That's what I had in mind. But I very clearly remember Googling public confession, and one of the top hits, and this is crazy, but one of the top hits was the so-called Confession to the Murder of Emmett Till that was published in Look magazine in January of 1956. I read it, and my first response was, well, that's not a confession. There was no like ethos of guilt or shame. There was no sort of apology to it. It had none of like the stylistic markers of the confession that I had in my head. And so I tried to like put it out of my head, but it haunted me and it stayed with me. And one of the reasons it stayed with me is because even though it didn't look like a confession, it was read from the floor of Congress into the historical record as if it was a confession. And actually what really blew me away is that this sort of story in Look magazine, which for what it's worth, is the single most influential and single most misleading story of Emmett Till's murder ever to be published, right? But in this moment of spring 1956, both the NAACP and the White Citizens Councils, like think about that, like the sort of institutions at the opposite end of that cultural moment, like one fighting for justice, one fighting for white supremacy, both of them come together and say, that story is a confession and it's true. And that just puzzled me. right? And the reason was, well, the NAACP was trying to convince Eisenhower to take his commission into the South and fight racism. And so they were like, look, true story of lynching. Whereas the White Citizens Council looked at the story told in Look magazine, and they're like, look, this story has only 2 murderers in it, and we know there were actually 4. So the Look magazine is a nicely sanitized version. And so they rallied behind it, right? And the result is when you have both the leading social justice organization and the leading white supremacist organization both validating the same story, lo and behold, right, the next 50 years, and you can document this, right? The next 50 years, virtually every story told are spin-offs of the fundamental lie that was published in Look magazine. And I won't dwell on this, but one of the particularly fascinating things is that Look magazine telling of the Till story eliminated an entire county from the events that happened on the night Till was killed. Till was actually killed in Sunflower County, and the ABC miniseries is doing a great job of capturing the Sunflower County part of the story. But Look magazine left that out, right? And the reason they left it out is because they needed to have like signed waivers from everyone who participated in the event before they would publish it. And the person who owned the property in Sunflower County was a brother of the acquitted murderer J.W. Milam. But because his brother, his name was Leslie, because Leslie was never tried, he did not enjoy the protections of double jeopardy, so he would not sign a waiver. So Look magazine just eliminated Sunflower County. And get this is the crazy part, lo and behold, every single map of the murder published between 1956 and 2004 eliminate, just like don't even show you Sunflower County. So that's like how much this Look magazine story began to dominate. And so I became kind of fascinated with the sort of cultural dominance of this single telling. And I started to write about it and publish on it. And actually what happened was a friend of mine saw my early work on this Look magazine story, sent it to the nonprofit in Mississippi. And that's how, when they had this summit on how to tell the story in the context of vandalism, that's how they got my number and called me. So I would say that's how I initially got into it. And then going down there in 2014, that was like a deepening moment that I've already shared.
Just to drive home, I happen to have here on hand Stephen J. Whitfield's Death in the Delta, and the opening map. Yep, no Sunflower County. You know, it is.
Thank you. I love that.
It's just mind-boggling how, you know, powerful this false narrative was, because at least 2 of the perpetrators were so willing to acknowledge, and they did it for money, you know, but their acknowledgement of this, you know, whether you want to call it a confession or not, just the fact that they did it rather than denied it, you know, proved powerful for so many interests.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours on this topic, but I won't. I will spare you that. I'll only sort of add that book that guy held up was the first book published by a university press. So it came out with like this aura of like, finally we have an authoritative account. I think it was 87 it was published, maybe 88. Okay, and so like finally 38 whatever years later, we finally have an authoritative account, but even there, totally beholden to the Look magazine narrative.
Right. And I was struck while you were talking about the issue of vandalism of the signs, that it seems, you know, the vandalism is actually in some ways mirroring the original murder, the desire to get rid of something, and then you amplify the fact that you've gotten rid of it, and, you know, only draw even more attention to what's going on in rural Mississippi.
Yeah, and that lesson, for what it's worth, was not lost on the local community. The first time I heard that sentiment, that the vandalism mirrors the lynching, was from a woman named Jessie Janes Dimming, who longtime resident of Tallahatchie County, who has served as a tour guide. A great woman. She was, sorry, I was going to say she was on the stage at Smithsonian with me, but I realized you weren't there. But Jessie Janes Dimming, when this happened, the first thing she said was, it's 1955 all over again.
Mhm.
And I think you can push the parallel even further, because what happened was, like, part of living in the South, right? Part of the Jim Crow experience was that public space never acknowledged or dignified the Black experience, right? And actually, sort of the silence of public space outlasted Jim Crow by decades, right? I mean, I don't know when you want to date the end of Jim Crow, but say you date it to MLK's assassination, 68. Well, it's still, what, 40 years?
Mhm.
Before people finally start trying to sort of publicly recognize the Black experience with these sort of markers of what happened to Emmett Till, right? And then the next thing that happens is those markers are filled with bullet holes. That seems to me an act of terrorism. And it also seems to me to be, what would you say? It takes what was intended to be a marker of the Black experience and turns it into one more reminder of white supremacy, right? It's almost, and I actually argued this in the Tribune at one point, it's almost like the flaming crosses of the Klan, right? In that it sort of has this hint of violence to it, actually not hint, it has this overt threat of violence to it. At the same time, it's marking that this is white supremacist territory, and you cannot sort of mark this land otherwise.
Mm. Yeah. And, you know, I've had so many thoughts reading your book. And another thing that struck me was that there's so many sites relating to the Till murder, where he was kidnapped, the farm where the gin fan, you know, was taken from, where he was apparently dumped into the river, although that's very contested, where he was, you know, the body was retrieved, the Tallahatchie County Courthouse, you know, where the original trial was held. And, you know, you drive home the fact, especially in your introduction, and then especially in your discussion of the Tallahatchie County Courthouse, that, you know, the economic well-being of entire towns hinges upon questions as to where the body was dumped. And, you know, it's almost, it's like the map of the Till murder kind of becomes a Via Dolorosa, Stations of the Cross, where these things happen. And, you know, I found myself honestly a bit uncomfortable that there are these kind of forensic facts about, you know, this brutal event that then translate into potential tourism and development. Did you at all ever feel uncomfortable about that?
So it's not just you. I mean, and you know this guy, I know that, but the intersection of tourism and commemoration is fraught, right? And I will just say that I think it's important to take these on a case-by-case basis. I think sometimes, you know, it feels like people are just in it to make a buck, and they'd be willing to bend any story in order to win tourism dollars. And you can see a little bit of that in sort of some of the fight over, like, where exactly was Emmett Till's body dropped in the water? But at other times, I feel like tourism becomes a vehicle for incredible social justice work. And I want to say a little more on this, but I also want to say, full disclosure, right? The Emmett Till Memory Project is a GPS-enabled tourism app. I'm not what would you say? I'm not unbiased in the matter. It was reviewed in this report, the Memory Project was reviewed in the Chicago Tribune. That's not the important part. The important part is it was reviewed in the travel section of like when the Tribune saw this, they're like, oh, this is a tourism app.
Right.
And so I think it's really important to try and distinguish good tourism from bad. I always get a kick out of this photograph right here. What you're looking at is the interior hallway of a Mississippi graphic design firm. And this graphic design firm holds all the contracts to make both of these signs. Right on the right is the Mississippi Blues Trail, an example of a Mississippi Blues Trail sign. And the Mississippi Blues Trail is an incredibly profitable tourism trail that was started in the early 2000s. And I mean, there are hundreds of these signs. And it was so profitable that Visit Mississippi, which is the tourism wing of the state of Mississippi, has all these, there's now a country music trail, there's a writer's trail, and among other things, starting in 2011, there's a civil rights trail. They call it the Mississippi Freedom Trail. And that's the sign on the left. And these two signs, they just happened to be in the hallway that day because they were both in for repair. I don't even know the stories behind it. But what struck me was, in the state of Mississippi, if you follow like the budgets up, where you eventually get to is Visit Mississippi, like the tourism wing. That's who funds civil rights work. And if you look even closely at these signs, you'll see the blue sign, the Blues Trail sign has a like circular record on top. Right. And so when it came time in 2011 to make a Freedom Trail, they sort of copied the basic design of the Blues Trail. They just stretched it out and made it an oval. Right. And so that even the shape of the sign is a reminder that at the end of the day, Mississippi put these signs up. And I'm not being, well, I'm being a little bit critical. They put these signs up not because they cared about social justice. They cared about it because they cared about tourism, right? If you, the same, and here, this is crazy, but the same like government bill that funded the Mississippi Freedom Trail also funded the restoration of Confederate General J.Z. George, right? What I'm trying to say is there was no like moral impetus in the state of Mississippi saying, let's commemorate the civil rights movement. There was a tourism-driven profit motive saying, let's do the Blues Trail, let's do the civil rights movement, and let's do the home of J.Z. George, right? All on one vote, right? There's a couple stories that really illustrate the way tourism and profit and commemoration have come together in very different ways, even within the confines of the Till story. I mean, the first example I can think of is just to think about the Sumner County Courthouse. This is the venue of the Emmett Till trial in 1955. If you've been watching the ABC miniseries, you've seen some great shots of this room, way better than I've put on your screen right now. But for reasons I won't go into, well, the county had two courthouses, but they didn't need to. So they kind of ignored this one, and this one very quickly fell into disrepair. So in the 1970s, they had to repair this courthouse, but the repair was so invasive. And here you just have a little snapshot. They took the chairs out and put in pews. They added 3 hallways around the edge of the courtroom. They painted it purple. They added a drop ceiling. And the repair was so invasive that locals accused the architect of hiding the history of Emmett Till, right? So then, that's the 70s. Then you fast forward to the early 2000s, right? And what happens is tourism, right? The courthouse was about to be demolished, right? And if the courtroom would have been demolished, the local legal industry would have gone away. I mean, if you've been to Sumner, right, you know that comparatively speaking, compared to the other small towns in the Mississippi Delta, you can tell that Sumner is charming and alive. It has a sit-down restaurant, one of the few in the Delta, by the way, that's owned by a Black woman. But the thing that makes Sumner different is it has the courthouse, it has the legal industry that keeps the money flowing into it, right? And so when the building was about to be demolished in 2005, guess who starts rallying to its defense? Of all people, and you've seen him on ABC if you've been watching, the white lawyer Sidney Carleton, who in 1955 defended the murderers. Well, fast forward 50 years, and Sidney Carleton was about to lose his job, right? Because his courthouse was about to be demolished. And so what he does is he says there might not be tax money to repair the courthouse, but perhaps there is grant money to restore the courthouse to its 1955 condition. So all of a sudden, Sidney Carleton, white lawyer, defended the murderers of all people, right? Comes around to Emmett Till commemoration. And why? Because he wants his job. It's the profit motive, right? That sounds really bad in one sense, but look at all the good that has come out of it. Once the Emmett Till Memorial Commission was founded in 2005 to save the courthouse, they also founded the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, which has done more to commemorate Till's work than any other group in Mississippi. They also run youth programs every summer to teach social justice to the, and so like innumerable good things have come out of what was initially a profit grab attempt to save people's jobs by producing tourism. So I don't know what you make of all that, only to say that the mixture of commerce and commemoration is always going to be complex, and I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
I know Ashley wants to get to some viewer questions. I mean, we could talk about this all night, I'm sure.
Well, I'm hoping these questions will kind of just spark further conversation, but I did want to go ahead and get to some of the questions in the chat. First of all, Sam Watson would like to hear more about the app, how it works, how it encourages remembrances, and if you see how you see similar apps working in the future.
So here's a screenshot of some of the various screens, and in a second, when I'm not talking, I'll throw a link in the chat and you can all download the app. That would actually be greatly appreciated. It's free. So what it does is it uses GPS technology to take you to a site, and then, like I said, it provides photographs, background, archival documents. Okay, but here's the thing. The vision of the Emmett Till Memory Project was never simply to take the story and transfer it from aluminum that kept getting shot up and put it on an app, right? And obviously that's an important part, but we were scared, I was scared as a memory maker, so to speak, that people might say, oh, great, the story's on the app, so I don't really have to worry about it anymore, right? That's like exactly the wrong response. So here's what we did, is that we calibrated the story of Till's murder to a user's location in the Mississippi Delta. So if you're standing at the courthouse, you will get the jury's version of the story. And you know the jury was totally wrong. They told a totally wrong version of the story. But if you're at the lodge, at the hotel where the Black Press stayed, then you'll get, or the home of T.R.M. Howard, he's been in the ABC miniseries, then you'll get Howard's version of the story, which is true, right? And so here's the conceit. As the user moves from site to site, they'll see the story shift, right? Because at each place, we're telling the story from the perspective of people who were in that place. And as the user moves, the story shifts. And as the story shifts, our hope is that the user will actually then be prompted or provoked to engage the story in a more sort of intellectually rigorous sense, right? Because if you think about commemoration too much, you know that statues and apps are never going to save the past, right? What's going to happen, the past is only secure to the extent that people engage with it. And so our hope, and we've gone through a number of different ideas about how to do this, our hope is that as we put the story on the Emmett Till Memory Project, we're doing it in such a way that will provoke people to engage with the story in personal ways. And so as we move forward, I mean, we're working with this group of professional designers, and we're thinking like, okay, and our app is not nearly this cool right now, but the vision is that for in the future, once we upgrade it, you'll come into a spot and then you'll enter a 3D rendering, right? And that 3D rendering will show you what There'll be some AR work there showing you what it used to look like. And then as you move into the site, you'll have an audio voiceover from people like Wheeler Parker telling you the story of what happened there. And then as you come through that voiceover, then you're going to get a question on the screen that's an action step. Like how do I personally respond to the story I've learned? And that's the part that we're really trying to double down on as we move forward. Like, it's not just about adding new technology, although it is, because new technology is cool. But it's also about using that technology to sort of help people engage and not just bounce off of it.
That sounds all very fantastic. We also have a question from Savannah, who brought up the issue of security cameras. She says, I remember a popular story in 2019 about the cameras capturing a white nationalist, potential vandals. Do you know if this is monitored by state, local law agency enforcement or enforcement agencies? And then what are the implications, or what are your thoughts on that?
So no, the video feeds are monitored by the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, which of course is a nonprofit with no law enforcement authority whatsoever. And truth be told, none of the vandalism has ever been so much as investigated by law enforcement. The most dramatic episode of this was, I don't know if you remember it, I took this slide out of my deck tonight, but in 2019, the journalist Jerry Mitchell broke the story of 3 University of Mississippi fraternity brothers posed in front of the sign with both a hunting rifle and an assault rifle, right? And we knew the names of these boys, right? It was, if ever there was an easy investigation, this was it. But years passed, and neither the university nor law enforcement ever investigated. Contrast that with the 2019 vandalism of the Confederate monument on the University of Mississippi campus, which, and I'm not making this up, although it's so dramatic you might think I am. When a vandal spray painted the Confederate monument, he was arrested while the paint was still wet on his hands, right? Consider the differential responses there of law enforcement. You deface a Confederate monument, we're on you before the paint is dry. But if we have sort of visual proof that 3 white boys were at the scene of a crime, we're not even going to investigate, right? That contrast has always blown my mind.
Latanya asked, is the traveling museum that you mentioned earlier an extension of the app? And do you know if the traveling museum will be made into a virtual experience at a later date?
It is, the same people are making both things, right? And so there's a lot of conversation between, and I'm on both teams, the team that's making the traveling exhibit and the team that's making the app. They are not formally related to each other. At a time, it was our hope that the new version of the app would be ready for the launching of the traveling exhibit, but that's not going to happen unless, you know, one of you has $500,000, then we might be able to make it happen. What was the next part of the question? I do not, oh, that's a good question. I do not know if it's going to be a traveling exhibit. The exhibit, one of the cool things about this is that after it does its big tour, it's going to become the property of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, which is in Sumner. It's a little museum in Sumner across the street from the courthouse. So it's going to like radically transform and radically upgrade their little museum there in Sumner. But there will also be a process in place where other museums across the country can request it, and it will continue to circulate. And so with the funding that we have, I think we have 6 sites that we are providing like free of charge to the local hosts. But then after that initial tour, people, if they have the money, I have no idea how much it will cost, will be able to request it, and there will be procedures in place to allow the traveling exhibit to continue to travel.
The last question that we have in the chat, Percy would like to know, can you talk about why it would have been very dangerous for Moses Wright to use the guns he had in the house to stop Milam and Bryant from taking Emmett?
I'm gonna be honest here. I'm not sure I knew the part about Moses Wright having guns in his house. But that's maybe a side point here. I mean, I think ABC captured this pretty well. I don't know if you're watching along. I think they do a great job of capturing. This is not like a contest between like equally powerful people in which like some white men come in with guns and could be sort of pushed back by black men with guns. It's just like, that's not the way it happened. I mean, you remember the next morning, right? Moses Wright would not even call the police at first, right? He's like, the police are not going to help us, right? And so it was a culture in which all the power and all the authority were with white law enforcement. And like was it J.W. Milam said supposedly at the abduction that if Moses Wright ever talked about what happened that night, he would not live to be 65, right? That was what was going on. And I think one of the what was I gonna say? One of the great stories about Moses Wright is his sheer courage. I mean, Moses Wright is nothing if not courageous, right? And that's what, when in 1987, when Eyes on the Prize is released, you might remember that's, what is it, like a 11-hour documentary, and both the first and last scenes are not just of Emmett Till, but the first and last scenes are of Moses Wright, because for Henry Hampton, who was making Eyes on the Prize, he put the Emmett Till story first because he's like, this is a movement by Black people for Black people, and Mose Wright is our like poster boy for that because he was so courageous. So I think that's some context as well for that question. Yeah, and I believe you. I see Simeon said that in his book. I totally believe you. I just was unaware of that.
Well, we're coming up over 7 o'clock, and I don't want to keep anyone here longer than they were expecting. So Dr. Till and Dr. Lancaster, if you have any final remarks or final comments, we'd love to hear them, and then we will be signing off.
I'll just conclude first by saying thank you. And second, this is something I tell my students here at the University of Kansas. And it's a way of appreciating your work in public history. I tell my students that history is not like God or like gravity, in the sense that you can turn your back on it, return to it at your leisure, and find it as you left it. If you ignore your history, if we ignore our history, it will be taken from us. And so I just want to I tell that to my students. I want to give that a shout out here as a way of saying thank you to Ashley with her work at the University of Arkansas Little Rock downtown, to Guy with his work on the encyclopedia, and to all of the work. I know Ashley gave me a rundown of all the work that's represented by the people on the screen. And although I can't name it all, I'm grateful for your work, and be in touch.
I just want to say thank you also to everyone, to Ashley for hosting us, and to Dave Tell. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you, and you know, one day you'll have to come to Little Rock and we can hang out and discuss all of these ideas more. I'd love that. As he noted, history, you have to keep engaging with it, and so anyone who's interested in the history of racial violence and also the reaction to and against racial violence here in Arkansas, I encourage them to go to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. We cover where we're adding entries on the many lynchings that happen in the state, as well as organizations that have resisted that violence and fought against it and tried to advance the state, often in the face of extreme resistance. You know, engage with this history, contact us, share the stories. You know, we need your help to make this the best you know, historical resource for our state that we can. And I'm pleased that everyone showed up here tonight. Thank you for coming, and have a good day, and I hope one day we'll be doing this in person.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and then be sure to check out the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement website at apjmm.org to find out more about the various events and programs going on throughout the week in recognition of the National Day of Racial Healing. Thank you very much, and we will be closing out.